That's what I was doing. Okay, we are working our way through the commentary or the introduction by Father Garrigou-Lagrange in his book Reality, in which he has a chapter entitled The 24 Thomistic Theses. So that's what we've been working our way through, and I'm going to continue using this commentary approach to it. I had mentioned in the last class the distinction between passive potency and active potency. And Patricia, you were kind enough to ask me a question about that, and it made me realize we need to talk a little bit more about it, because we were talking in the last class about the distinction between potency and act. And the difficulty is a lot of people have trouble staying away from act that isn't there. They don't realize when you say potency, it means potency. Potency means something you don't have, something you could have, but you don't have it. So, and you might wonder, well, if a passive potency is just the capacity to receive something, what is an active potency? An active potency sounds like it's something that's already springing into action. And if you think of it that way, you're going to get in trouble because you're giving it something it doesn't have. The distinction between a passive potency and an active potency is that the passive potency is just receiving the action of the agent, period. An active potency refers to something that has the ability to do something, and it gets put into the act of doing it. Probably the easiest way to see the difference is imagine a football game. A passive potency would be the ability to be tackled. As you can see, that doesn't take much ability, does it? You just have to be a target. You just have to be able to be tackled. An active potency would be the tackler, the one who does the tackling. And it sounds like the tackler is somehow already in action, and that isn't what it means. Because in order for the tackler to tackle, he has to go from being potentially tackling to actually tackling. And to go from potentially tackling means he isn't yet tackling. Potential is on the side of non-being. When he's put into the act of tackling, then that is an active potency being actualized. Patricia?
Can you repeat the definition that you gave for active potency, please?
Did I give one?
Well, I wrote down for passive, just receiving the action of the
Right.
agent.
When you talk about an active potency, you're talking about something in a thing which it by its nature is suited to do. For example, sight is suited to the act of seeing. The intellect is suited to the act of understanding. And therefore it can go into its own proper act. Sight has as its proper act seeing. The intellect has as its proper act understanding, judging, reasoning. But you've got to realize when they're not doing these things, they are purely potential to doing them. And therefore, something's got to get them into the act of doing it. In other words, when you're not seeing, something to start seeing means to go from potency to act, from non-being to being with reference to seeing. So since you can't give yourself what you do not have, something has to put you into the act of seeing. But it's called an active potency because you're not just sitting there receiving totally. What is happening is you are enabled, you are sustained, you are supported in going into the act that your nature is ordered to. Now, what does it take for example, in order to understand. The intellect itself is a tabula rasa. It's a blank tablet. Doesn't know anything in its nature. It only knows when some intelligible object is presented to it by the process of abstraction. You encounter a cow, and from this you abstract the notion of animal, because that's the proper philosophical species. You think cow is, but it isn't. That's the biological species. So, in order to form the concept of cowness, you really got to have a couple things happen. One, you've got to have the cow in front of you, and you've got to, from that cow's got to make an impression on your senses, so that you form an image from which you can abstract the essence of cowness or animal. But the intellect, which is a potency, has to be put into act. As a matter of fact, as you know, if you study abstraction, you've got really two intellects. You've got a potential intellect and an active intellect. So it's through the agency of the active intellect illuminating the intelligible essence within the phantasm to form the impressed intelligible species of cowness or animality, whatever you have. And that's what puts the potential intellect into the act of actually understanding animality or the concept. So even though you've got now notice, when you understand, that's the act of the intellect. That's something you can do. The cow can't do it. A tree can't do it. A stone can't do it. So it's an activity that's appropriate to your nature as a human being, that you can actually understand. But unless something puts your potency into act, you're not going to understand. That's an active potency, because it's a potency ordered to a specific act. It's not just a matter of receiving something. When you go into the act of understanding, it is your act as an intellectual being. It's something you are actually doing, as opposed to being tackled, which is just something that happens to you. When a bird sees a seed, that's an act of sensation on the part of the bird. But the point is, these are still potentialities, they're faculties. They're what we call operative potencies, an ability, a potency to do something. So that's why they are active potencies. They've got to be put into act in order for them to operate and attain their proper end. But the important thing to notice here, the reason I emphasize that they are still potencies, is because you don't want to have them doing things on their own without anything actualizing them. Because if they did that, they'd already be an act, and they wouldn't really be potential. And the danger of that arises when we look at Suarez. Because Suarez, when he's explaining how the will works, he describes it as an act of potency in the sense that it somehow actualizes itself. A potency can't actualize itself, because to actualize itself, it would have to have the act which it doesn't yet have because it's potential. It would have to give itself something it doesn't have. The whole notion of being potential is you don't have something. You got to get it from somewhere. But because you don't have it, you can't give it to yourself. So something else has to actualize you. Nothing actualizes its own potency. So whether it's a passive potency or an active potency, something else has to put it into the act of actually understanding or seeing or whatever it's doing. And this is extremely important because, as I say, otherwise you get a world in which things are able to actualize themselves. And if they can actualize themselves, what happens to God? You don't need God as a first cause because everything's running itself. But of course, it's metaphysical magic. Things can't run themselves. They can't actualize themselves. They're giving themselves something they don't have. I know I'm overemphasizing one single point here, but it's a metaphysical cataclysm if you get it wrong.
The question I had about that is, like the example that Father Garrigou-Lagrange gives is the sculptor sculpting a statue out of wood, and that potency has to be actualized by somebody doing it. But is there a different category or way of understanding the potency that, say, is within a newborn baby to have become a high school graduate, to become an old man?
Yes.
You don't see someone on the outside pushing them through all the
Right.
stages. It seems that it is self-actualizing.
Well, not self-actualizing, it's an active potency, because it has the potential to to develop these things. We'd say to develop itself, but it doesn't really develop itself. It has the potency to be developed, to go into the act of developing, but something has to still actualize that activity. What is critical here is to realize the radical potentiality of every finite being. If you understand this, what you have is a proof for God's existence, because it's the proof for motion. It's the proof from the realization that every finite being is just what it is. Here and now, that baby is just what it is. How does it give itself the new stages of development that it realizes as it grows up? If you say it can give it to itself, what you're saying is it's giving to itself states of reality it doesn't yet have. How do you do that? That's the whole point of the first way. It's the whole point of the notion that you can't go from potency to act all by yourself. That in order to have motion, change, becoming, you have to have something go from potency to act, but nothing can go from potency to act by itself. Something else, some external agent must actualize the potency. That's why if you get this wrong, your whole metaphysics becomes self-actualizing, and if it's self-actualizing, the world runs on its own, and David Hume is right, nature explains itself and you don't need God.
And that's modern science, the way it's explained.
The way it's modern science as interpreted according to Humean metaphysics, or materialistic metaphysics, if you can use the term. So we cannot possibly overemphasize this point. The radical defense of the distinction between potency and act is central to the whole of metaphysics. It's central to the whole of philosophy. So we can't overdo it. I may bore you to death, but I'd rather do that than have you walk out Chardanians, because that's what you'd become, process philosophers, Heracliteans. You'd live in a world in which things just actualize themselves. It's pure process. Everything's just ongoing in its merry way, and it doesn't need anything else. It's a Hegelian world. Everything's just begetting, becoming. And you don't need God. The whole insight, the key that Aristotle and, of course, St. Thomas in the Prima Via makes is the recognition that potentiality is really just potentiality. It can't actualize itself. And if you don't understand that, you're still in trouble. You know, in philosophy, it's very important to know what you don't know. Because if you don't understand something, and you know you don't understand it, at least you're not dangerous. The problem is the people who think they understand what they don't understand. And remember how many times I've told you, philosophy comes down to real simple stuff. But if you don't understand the simple stuff, you're going to get in a lot of trouble with the complicated stuff. So, and that little notion of active potency is pure poison if it's misunderstood. Very, very dangerous stuff, because it makes it sound like something that's potential can actualize itself, and it doesn't mean that. It means that certain potencies are potencies to a certain type of activity. That's why we call them active potencies. It doesn't mean they've already got the act. So, an intellectual being has a potency to actually understand. But in itself, it's not understanding, unless and until something or some set of conditions makes it understand. Then when it understands, it's in the act of understanding. So this was a potency towards a certain act. That's why it's called an active potency. But it doesn't mean that it is self-actuating. It doesn't mean that it made itself understand. That's the key point. To understand needs the help of a lot of stuff. Your potential intellect is just sitting there waiting to get impressed by an intelligible species abstracted from a phantasm by the agent intellect, which then impresses it upon the potential intellect and puts it into the act of understanding. That's a far cry from doing it all by itself. But this is why people don't understand the first way of St. Thomas, the way from motion. The reason people don't grasp it is because they think things explain their own motion. The modern materialist scientific view is things are just eternally in motion. Gravity makes things move. Momentum makes things move. They explain their own motion. What do you need God for? The only way you can crack that absurdity is by realizing that things in motion do not move themselves, even if they are in a state of momentum, going from point A to point B. Newton is describing the way things behave, but he's not explaining how they do it. And that's why in his optics, he points out that there must be some kind of a universal force that puts things in motion, and once they are in motion, keeps them in motion from point A to B to C to D. That Newton said that. His modern day disciples don't understand it, but he was metaphysically correct. The body in motion still needs an explanation of its progressive actualization, because it's constantly getting new states of activity, new states of being, new positions in the space-time continuum, which it didn't have before. And if it didn't have it before, how could it give it to itself? Now, this is simple stuff. You don't have something, you can't give it to yourself. Real simple. But look at the complex errors that arise from not realizing that. If you don't have $50, you can't give me $50. All the wishful thinking in the world isn't going to make it happen. You just don't have it. And that's why something in a state of potency can't actualize itself. You don't have $50, you can't give yourself $50. Really simple. I know we can raise the national debt to do it. That's the fallacy of the national debt, isn't it? We're making something out of nothing. It used to be that they say you can't, rob from Peter to pay Paul. The U.S. Treasury right now is robbing from Peter to pay Peter. We're selling our own debt to ourselves. We're selling treasury bills to the Fed, and the Fed's buying them from itself. Anything wrong with that picture? This is metaphysical madness, but it's national policy. That's kind of scary. You try to do it yourself and see how long the bankers don't come after you. You can do it if you print your own money, as long as everybody recognizes that paper. Good luck. If you think you can do it to infinity, you've got a problem. So, in a sense, we're viewing in history a metaphysical experiment. We're trying, the American government is trying to make something out of nothing. By the time some people hear what I'm saying, it will have been demonstrated that it didn't work. And of course, what happens when you do that? I don't want to get into economics 101 here, but of course, the problem is eventually somebody looks from the outside, like the Europeans or the Chinese, and say, this isn't real. And I'm not going to recognize the value of your money anymore. And when I don't recognize the value of your money, you're going to have to give me a lot more of it before I buy something from you. And what do we call that? That's called inflation.
The effects of inflation.
Or we go and attack them. That's what the United States does.
So
Go and attack nations like Libya, who
Yeah.
produce their own money out of gold.
yeah, well,
Gaddafi was killed for making his own money.
well, if you make your money out of gold, that's good. But if you're not making out of gold, the problem is when people don't recognize its value,
There was gold.
it will become worthless. And therefore, you can have all the money you want. They'll keep giving you the money. You'll keep getting the money. You just can't buy anything with it. Ever hear of the Weimar Republic? They used to use the money to paper the walls because it had more value as wallpaper. But again, to come back to the metaphysics, this is an application of the metaphysical principle that you can't get being from non-being. You can't get something from nothing. You can't have something that is just potential and make it actualize itself. Anyway, I was just explaining something left over from the previous class. But is there anybody who's still got a question about it? You got a question about it?
Yes, what were you talking about?
We'll start over. Okay, we'll go on to a further point then. But this is why Father Lagrange says the proof, that is the first way, rests on the real distinction of potency from act. If there isn't a real difference between potency and act, the arguments don't work. But this is not just an hypothesis. Potency and act isn't just a concept, a notion that Aristotle came up with. We have seen why it is a real distinction between potency and act. And once you understand, and it's got to be a real distinction because the potency potential is non-being relative to the act. So unless being is identical to non-being, potency has to be distinct from act. And of course, the irony of it, not surprisingly, the process philosophers deny the principle of non-contradiction. They have to. Being and non-being are the same. Hegel does it. Being begets non-being, and by some magic, that begets becoming. There's no distinction in process philosophy between, as Lagrange says, in God is existence and his nature, than the difference between yourself and the wall. There's no difference. There's no real distinction. And this is also why the people like Loisy and Tyrrell and others, Bergson, attack what they call the postulate of morcellation. Now, what they're talking about is the awareness that we have that there are multiple things in the world. Remember, Parmenides also denied multiplicity, because that goes with the territory. If things are really multiple, that means one is not the other. If one is not the other, then you know the difference between the being this has and the being that has, and that one is non-being in reference to the other. In other words, you recognize the reality of the principle of non-contradiction. Being is not non-being. A thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. The process philosophers actually deny this. Because for them, being is in a constant state of becoming, so you can never say that it is what it is at any given point in time. It's just like Bergson would say, like of Niagara Falls, it's a process. When you take a motion picture of it, you stop you get a picture, and they're distinct. But he says that's not the reality. The reality is constant process. So he really denies that there are distinct states. If things are simply in a state of becoming, then they are self-actualizing. That's how you get a completely different school of philosophy. The school of philosophy coming from Heraclitus, from Bergson, from the evolutionists generally, are all belonging to a school that says the basic principles like non-contradiction are not real. And you can't know them. They will allow them on a macroscopic level as a kind of a rule of thumb, operating on what they call a stochastic basis. But that's why at the submicroscopic level, they would deny that the principle of non-contradiction applies. And they will offer you physical experiments to prove that a thing at the subatomic level can both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. That's why this very simple starting point is the division between whole sections of philosophy. To insist that there's a real distinction between potency and act puts you in a different world from all the process philosophers. And understandably, in their world, since the world actualizes itself, there is no need for a transcendental first cause. So you cannot overstate the importance of the distinction between potency and act. The whole of philosophy depends on it. It's not just one little tiny theorem, one little bit, one little part. It's the central metaphysical insight. As Dr. Waters has repeatedly said, I believe he called it peak insight. This is why. We're not just peeking in. It is a peak. It is the top. It is a central thesis. If you deny it, then magic becomes the rule. Anything can become anything. Alice in Wonderland takes over. Charles L. Dodson is right. Of course, he was right. He was poking fun at the philosophies that allow anything possible. If you once deny the principle of non-contradiction, there are an infinite multitude of possible worlds that could be. Because you got rid of the rule. There are no rules. You can make up a new rule. And that's what he was getting at in Through the Looking Glass and Alice in Wonderland. That's a world in which there aren't any rules. You can violate the basic rules of reality. But reality does have some basic rules. If you don't want to wind up in the metaphysical bedlam, there are basic rules, and the most basic rule is the principle of non-contradiction, and with it, the real distinction between one thing and another thing, such that if one thing is lacking something another's got, it can't give it to itself. And once you say that, you've allowed the distinction between potency and act. Potential is on the side of non-being. Act is on the side of being. I know it sounds horribly simple when you just say, well, you can't give something to yourself, but we've got whole schools of philosophy out there built on ontological welfare state. You can give something to yourself. In fact, we've built whole societies. That's what we're doing right now. The great economic experiment that we're in, a society in which it is trying to lift itself up by its own bootstraps, by simply creating wealth out of nothing. And if you can see in metaphysics it doesn't work, don't be surprised if it doesn't work in the economic order. Big shock. Okay, unless you have more questions on this, I'll go back to the text, which probably will get us. We're going to be applying the principle, the basic principle, to a number of contexts. Or to be more precise, this is Father Lagrange says that at the Thomistic Congress held in Rome in 1925, we illustrated the inner unity of the 24 Theses by showing the far-reaching consequences of the distinction between potency and act. Key to a number of contexts. I'm not going to try to do all of them, but I will do some of them. He says, first of all, we note 10 consequences of the principle that potency is really and objectively distinct from act. Now notice, I know I was continually repeating this to you. He's saying the same thing. You can't overstate the importance of the distinction of potency from act. Number one, first thing, first application, matter is not form. Why? Because matter is potential to form. If it's potential to form, it's not form, because potency is not act. It is really distinct from form. Prime matter is pure potency, a mere receiving capacity. Without form, it simply cannot exist. I think, and I know from when I was first studying philosophy, the notion of pure potency kind of threw me because it sounds like it's nothing. It sounds like it's nothing. But again, think of that example of the block of marble that's going to get a certain form that it doesn't have. What he's saying is, without form, prime matter, pure potency, doesn't exist. You always find matter in some form, with some form, under some form. So the sense in which it is pure potency just means that any material thing potentially can become any other material thing. That's the meaning of pure potency, but it doesn't mean that it's nothing. It doesn't mean it's pure nothing. It's always, every material thing is always under some form, being actualized by some form. But it's pure potency because you can change it to something else. So don't think of pure potency as total non-being, but on the other hand, it is never anything by itself. It has always got to be under some form that actualizes it. And that's why form and matter are always together, and that's why you can't think of a universe in which you got matter here and form there, and you somehow put them together. You know, this is the problem with Plato, the problem with Descartes. This is why hylomorphism, form and matter, isn't just a doctrine. It's not just a theory. It's not just a hypothesis. It is a description of the way real physical things exist. That's all it is. Prime matter is always actualized by form. You can study how one form replaces another. You can talk about the difference between accidental and substantial forms, all that you want. But the notion of prime matter is simply that in a material world, material things can become other material things. Again, the problem with our friend Suarez is he thinks that the matter, maybe it's got just a little tiny bit of act. You know, just give me a little tiny bit of act, a little bit of reality by itself. And again, you're on the same slippery slope because you've allowed it to actualize its own potency. And that's not fair game. This is the problem. That's why Suarez isn't a doctor of the church. He's got this little poison pill in there every time, right at the basis of stuff. That potency somehow has, just give a little tiny bit of act that it owns. And the whole notion of potency is destroyed Because potency, by definition, is contradictory to act. It's what act isn't. It's what hasn't got act. And if it gets act, it gets it from something else. It has to beg, borrow, or steal it, but doesn't have it by itself. So matter is inconceivable without form. And remember, the importance of what we're doing here is we're nailing down the very foundations to metaphysics and to all philosophy. You couldn't have a more critical area of investigation than what we're doing right here, because it's what forbids people from engaging in metaphysical nonsense. You can say the words of a self-actualizing, ongoing process philosophy from the alpha to the omega, but it doesn't make it real. To make it real, you've got to conform to the laws of being. And the laws of being are given, remember, in our first immediate experience of a real world, and a real world in which there are distinctions, multiplicity. I see some 20 people here. Got a good class tonight. I have to count you and see if I'm right. But the very fact that you are, and you are multiple, gives me immediately an awareness of the reality of your being, and that one of you is not the other, or one aspect of you is not the other, or one aspect of my experience is not the other, and that gives me the distinction between being and non-being. And the awareness then that if something is non-being, it doesn't get being by itself because it's non-being. So this metaphysical certitude is rooted in the immediacy of our experience of the world. So we are truly realistic. This is realistic philosophy, as real as it gets. Not idealistic, where you hypothesize something and simply argue from the hypothesis. And that's why, again, Lewis Carroll is mocking the infinite multitude of philosophies that were extant in the 19th century. Because you could get all kinds of philosophies once you allow that the rules of the game can be fundamentally changed. But the problem is, if you deviate from the basic rules of being, you enter into Wonderland. There's nothing real anymore. Second point, matter is not form. Secondly, finite essence is not its own existence. Finite essence is really distinct from its own existence. Finite essence is a potency. It's a potential principle. It's what can be, but doesn't necessarily have to be. I'm not trying to prove it all at this point. I'm trying to show, though, how act and potency apply here. How many potential dinosaurs are walking around right now? Who could count them? But the problem is, unless they actually exist, it's just potency. It's not actuality. So the only thing that makes essence real is the act of existence. For Aristotle, form gave act. This is where St. Thomas goes one step further and points out, wait a minute, even if you got form and matter, which make essence, that by itself doesn't explain the actual existence, because, as he says, you can know what a man or phoenix is, but not know whether they exist in actuality. Existence is the act of all acts, the perfection of all perfections. It is what makes the essence to be and to be real. And without the act of existence, all the potency in the world is nothing. You know, probably most of us in here are potentially millionaires. The problem is we'll probably die that way. potency, again, you always got to remember, it doesn't do you any good. It's the actuality that gets you there. And potential existence is not actual existence. So finite essences, I mean, as we know from having demonstrated God's existence, it could have been perfectly possible that God would have been the only being that ever was. And we wouldn't be here discussing this. We are essences that got actualized because God made us. And we didn't have to. He didn't have to. And he would have been just as well off without us. And sometimes I think he might have been better off than. But now we're here, and he's got to put up with us. So, but that's, from all eternity, we are just, and everything in the created world is just a potentiality, something that could have been, but unless it was actually created, actually given existence, and being given existence is the act of creation, which can only come from a being which is pure act, pure existence, infinite God. And of course, that's number 3. I wasn't looking ahead here. God alone.
What's number 3?
Number 3 is God alone, pure act, is his own existence. He is existence itself, unreceived and irreceivable. That's a good word. Try that one on your spell check. Okay. And then he cites sum qui sum, taken from Exodus 3:14, I believe, where the burning bush, Moses asks, who should I tell the Israelites has sent me to them? And the answer that comes from God is, tell them that ego sum qui sum, I am who am, has sent you to them. Got 3 people that got to get them all straight. And in so saying, as St. Thomas suggests, God is actually telling us who he is and something about what he is in his very essence. He isn't the Almighty God that has existence. He isn't the eternal being that has existence, the necessary being that has existence, the most perfect being that has existence, but he is existence itself. Pure act, no potency whatever. Not the fulfillment of potencies, but the pure act of existence, which is the foundation for the potentiality of lesser beings. There is no potency in this 3rd point. It's just pure act. The next point I'm going to take up, I'm not taking every one of them. God alone, who is, of course, existence itself, can have no accidents. Of course, we here are talking about the distinction between accident and substance. We're not talking about a traffic accident. We're saying that God has in his being no accidental perfections. That is, there are no perfections added to him. Because after all, if you added them to him, where'd you get them from? Pray tell. I mean, we learn things. That perfects us. That makes us smarter. But that means there's a distinction between us and what we learned. And what we learned got added to us. So we weren't perfect to begin with. That's not God. God is perfect to begin with. He already has every possible perfection in his very essence. So there are no accidents. Again, we were talking about active potency. No created substance is immediately operative. In other words, a created substance first must be, but then if it's going to do something, that's an active potency that's being actualized. So you might have a horse that's able to run, but when it actually starts running, that's added to its essence. We are made as beings capable of understanding, judging, reasoning, willing, but those are accidental determinations or perfections added to our essence. We aren't created in the state of willing or created in the state of understanding. We are potential to those acts. Those operations are added to us. They are over and above our substance. In God, that's not the case. In God, they are identical to the substance. In other words, the created substance needs, in order to act, a superadded operative potency. Operative potency? What we call a power? Being an operative potency, now that means operate, able to do something, perform a work. Potency means it's able to perform a work. What does that mean? It says the created substance, in order to act, needs a superadded. In other words, you've got to add to it a potency to perform the work. Now, why do you have to add to it? Well, because that potency needs to be put into act. It's a potency. If, this is a little tricky, even in philosophical psychology, I remember it's a little hard to explain it, but it amounts to saying that, let's say you knew how to play the piano. Joe, I'll take your help here. We have an expert pianist here, and he really is. If the act of, you're not playing the piano right now, are you? Okay. The act of playing the piano, but you've certainly got the potency to do it, and he does, he's an expert. The ability to do that is in him, but it's not presently actuated. If he were identical with his power to act, to play the piano, and his power to play the piano were identical with the act of playing the piano, he'd have to always be playing the piano. Always. And indeed, if he stopped, he'd die. Because you're identifying the superadded activity with the existence itself. In other words, you've got the essence and its active existence, you've got the power and its act. If the act of the power were the same as the act of the essence, and the act of the essence is the existence, then the very to be would have to be identified with the activity, which in the case of playing the piano would mean you'd have to always be playing the piano or you'd cease to be. But no, created things like us, we have potencies added to us that can be turned on and off. Sometimes you play the piano, sometimes you drive the car. Sometimes you're sitting thinking, sometimes you're willing, sometimes you're listening to music. All of these potencies get turned on and off all the time as you go through life, but you don't get turned on and off all the time. So if the act of these powers were identical to the very basic act of the nature, when you turn the powers on and off, you'd be turning the essence on and off. You'd be being and not being. No, you are a substance existing with powers, and these powers are successively actuated. Some of the time, some not. And that's why the corresponding potencies that they have can't be your very essence. Because if the potencies turn on and off, and the potency were the same as the essence would be turned on and off. So you'd either be or not be, depending on whether you're playing the piano or not, or thinking or not. No, these are two different orders of reality. Your basic act of existence is continuous, but your powers to act are over and above that basic substance. Those are actuated or not actuated from time to time. And they have their own corresponding potency, which are what we call powers or faculties. And that's why your intellect is not your essence. Your will is not your essence. Rather, you have a human nature, and a property of that nature, property is a per se accident, added to it, is rationality. But the rationality is expressed as having an intellect and, of course, also a will. In other words, you're a rational animal by your very nature. But in addition to that nature, you have these faculties, these operative potencies. The highest ones you have are the intellect and the will. And those are super added to your nature. They are accidental to your nature. A little confusion there because we think of something accidental like being black or white or tall or short. Those things are just accidents that can come and go. But something like rationality is a property. That's a proper accident. It's got to be there. If you're a human being, you are rational. If you're a human being, you have free will. That comes with your nature. That doesn't come or go, but it still is superadded to the nature. So those accidents perfect the nature, and therefore they are acts in reference to the essence, which is potential to them. In other words, your intellect is an act in reference to the essence, which is potential to having an intellect. But the intellect itself is a potency to the further act of actually understanding. See how simple it all is? At least you can see you can't begin to understand if you don't talk in terms of potency and act. And that's what Father Lagrange is trying to say. Next point, form, and he's talking about substantial form, can be multiplied only by being received into matter. I'm sorry, he isn't talking about just substantial form. He's talking about any form. Form is multiplied by being received in matter. Remember, form is act. Matter is potency. All of us in this room share the substantial form of being human. What makes that form different from you to me to the person next to you? That form is received in different matter. You are physically a different being, a different substance because of your matter than the person next to you, although you share the same nature, the same human nature. Form is act. Matter is potency. So the potency here limits the act. So your humanity is limited in its expression to the individual instance that you are, whatever you got, whatever you don't have, because it's received in your particular matter. If all there was pure form, we'd all be the same being. And that's the case with angels. They're pure form. They don't have any matter to individuate them. So every individual angel is a species of its own. But we are all one species, share the same nature. That nature is received in diverse matter. For the same reason you could take an apple pie and you got one pie and you can cut it up into 8 pieces because it's quantitatively extended in space because it's material. Now you've got 8 pieces of pie. They're all apple pie, but there's 8 different pieces of pie. Before you had just one piece.
But for us, how does the individual soul work? I mean, you say we're differentiated by matter, but there's more to it than that. I mean, my soul is not the same as yours.
Your soul is essentially the same in that we are both rational animals. But our rationality is different because it's received in different matter. And, some people's rationality is better than others because their matter is better. Some people, we say you have a better brain or not as good a brain, but what you're really talking about is the form, the soul, being received into the particular conditions of matter because it's a different material being that you're talking about. And of course, some beings have better accidental perfections in the way their neurons are transmitted. Because again, when we say form is received in matter, this is true at the accidental level. For example, the color of these desks, whatever that is, what would you call it? What color is that?
Right.
Gray, okay. You don't have one big gray in here. You've got 9 different desks. So the grayness of this desk is different than the grayness of that desk because it is received in different material that is actuated by the color. Now, the desk itself is something of a sort. It's an accidental reality, so it's a little hard to talk about it. It's not a natural substance. But the color is an accident of the desk. And though you have the same color throughout the room of this, you have 9 different instances of it because that color is received in 9 different desks. So the same principle applies. The form, the act, the color perfects the desk in reference to the color, but that color is received in different individual instances because it's received in different material instances of the desk. The problem is that you do this with accidental forms. The examples we often use are accidental beings. Anything that we make are artifacts. So they're not really natural substances. It would be better to talk about the color of a couple horses because they're natural substances. One might be gray and another one might be white. So you have different colors received in different natural substances. The next one is a big topic. I don't know how far I can get into it tonight. Matter, in itself, has neither existence nor cognoscibility. That's what it says there, I think, if that's a word. Knowability. Knowability. Matter by itself, there's nothing to be known. It's pure potency. Remember, you don't have any real matter except it's under a form. And the point is, the intelligibility, all of the knowability of the matter comes from the form, the relation of the matter to the form. Matter by itself is unknowable, just as it can't exist by itself. It's form that gives existence to the matter, and it's form that gives knowability to the matter. The whole doctrine of knowledge depends on getting to grasp the forms of things, because the matter of itself doesn't tell you anything. Even if you're a physicist studying the material universe, you always want to understand the form of it. You want to understand the form of an atom. You want to understand its mathematical composition between protons and electrons, and internally its quarks and so forth. That's what enables you to understand it. It is given that it's material, but materiality as such doesn't tell you anything. Matter is simply the principle that allows the form to exist in a way that we can know it. Because the matter by itself would not be knowable, the form by itself would not be knowable unless it's in matter. Which leads us to the next doctrine, which I'm not going to really get into tonight, but I want you to start thinking about it. Immateriality is the root both of intelligibility and intellectuality. I know this stuff is difficult, but you've got to understand, what are we doing? We're doing the 24 theses that are at the very heart and root of Thomistic metaphysics. This isn't the stuff that was designed for the kindergarten crowd. This is the stuff that was designed for the experts in the field to guide them as to how you would know when you actually have a Thomistic doctrine. So please understand, that's why it's difficult. And hope most of you have had some prior background here, which would help you to grasp it.
Just repeat that again.
What did I say? Oh, immateriality is the root both of intelligibility and intellectuality. Why? I'm going to go over this again in the next class, but I want to leave you with something here. Because the way that you understand things is by abstracting the form from the matter. You pull the form away from the matter. Pulling the form away from the matter means you're dematerializing it. You're getting it out of the matter. And therefore, what you understand, to understand it, you leave the matter behind. So if I want to understand what's the nature of horseness, I don't care about this or that particular individual horse. I want to know what do horses have in common. So I have to get away from the individuating conditions of horseness. And remember, what individuated it was matter. I want to get away from those individuating conditions and just pull out of it the universal essence of horseness that I can understand. So what am I doing? I'm achieving immateriality to get understanding. So immateriality is the key to understanding the world. But that's hard to understand in 2 seconds, so we'll save that for another week.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services, all rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com